My name is Jean Cook. I'm the Future of Music Coalition. I'm the Director of Programs. As a reminder to the people here, we are recording this for webcast, which will be broadcast in approximately 6 to 8 weeks. Some of the other things that you're seeing today are being live webcasts. This one's being recorded for later. This session, Arts Policy under Obama, I'm going to offer a general framework and then let each of the panelists kind of reflect on the framework based on their personal experiences. But I think that you definitely touched on it. Like, everybody was very, very interested and very focused in saying, well, what's really going to be different? What's going to be changing? We, from the perspective of FMC and also from the perspective of a lot of groups that we work with, I think everybody agrees that right now is an extraordinary time. It's an extraordinary window of opportunity with more people in positions of power want to do the right thing than we have had in a very long time. Some examples that I can give, for example, the Department of Justice recently allowed the merger of Live Nation and Ticketmaster, and attached to that merger, they approved it and they attached to it some very strong conditions that said that they couldn't engage in anti-competitive behavior, that they had to have a firewall between certain aspects of their businesses, that they needed to open up the back end of certain pieces of their business so other folks could try and build some competition around it. That's been a really interesting experience from the FMC perspective, because a lot of folks in the music community were very against the merger, and they feel very much that once they approved the merger that the fight was over. When in fact, we're in a new era where that's actually the beginning of the fight. The DOJ is very committed to enforcing the consent decree, and they can't do it by themselves. They need the cooperation of the music community. They need to understand how the music and live performance business works, and what to be looking for, and how to even identify the anti-competitive behavior that they're fairly sure is going to be happening. And so this is an opportunity for partnership. That's one example with the Department of Justice. We've been seeing that across different agencies with the FCC and with HUD, with the Department of Agriculture, with NTIA, all of the different agencies that are out there that we have been connected with. We've been seeing kind of unprecedented opportunities all happening at once. Now, of course, when it all happens at once, it's a little overwhelming, because the people who are actually are used to talking to the administration and talking to agencies, there are only a few of them. And there are so many opportunities that it's very challenging to figure out how exactly you're going to engage. So this is kind of happening at the same time that a lot of folks, some of us are coming from the social justice movement, some of us are coming from media reform, media justice, or just artist rights. And in all cases, I think that we're seeing a lot of change within our movements as well. So we're going from being oppositional movements to being movements that are able to set a positive course of action and be visionary and kind of identify kind of what the positive solutions are that the new administration and the new agencies can adopt in setting policies for the future. This is a very difficult transformation, and there's a lot of learning that's been happening. There are different skill sets that you need to have. Meanwhile, on the policy front, as I mentioned, there's a tremendous amount to catch up on. There's a tremendous amount of catch-up in general that we have to play. Some examples include the FCC recently fast-tracking the National Broadband Plan, and setting out their priorities as they want everybody in the United States to be able to have access to high-speed internet, which is kind of at this point, kind of a fundamental right from the view of the current administration. As that stuff is going through, things like net neutrality regulations are going through very, very quickly. And then, of course, there's also the perennial favorites, media consolidation. The FCC is about to decide again, every 4 years, they sit down and decide how many radio stations a single corporation can own in which cities, and if they can own newspapers in addition to television stations, in addition to radio stations. So like all of these decisions are happening, they're all happening very concentrated. And I think that every aspect of from every corner of the movement, you're seeing a lot of different responses to that. So that's the general framework that I wanted to set forward. And now I'm going to starting with Helen, to kind of reflect on how you're seeing it from your perspective. And you can talk maybe a little bit about NAMAC, and then we'll kind of continue down the line.
I am the co-director of the National Alliance for Media, Arts, and Culture. We are in San Francisco, and we represent about 350 media-related organizations around the United States that are not necessarily journalism-related, but have to do with motion media, film and video, youth media, exhibitors, distributors, but outside of the music, outside of the film business. So I'm someone who's kind of coming from a different place than most of you have been here today who are from the music world. And so what NAMAC is very specifically an organization that does research on behalf of independent media and public media. We also convene people around the country, and we do advocacy and leadership training. And in order for our sector, which a lot of this has come so rapidly, we're a little bit, I think, behind the curve from you in terms of what musicians have seen happening, we're only beginning to see. So for us to really understand what we can do within this space, I like to come up with metaphors. And so I'll tell you a story of how I kind of see where film falls into all of this right now and why cultural policy is so important for media makers to engage in and artists, especially visual artists as well, who are outside of this. Last summer, I was taking a little walk around a lake in Utah. And as I was walking around, I noticed a kind of wetlands area. So I was looking out at the water, and I was standing on the ground above. And as I passed by this little wetlands area, I saw a sign. And the sign said, "This is a riparian zone." Well, I'm not a biologist, but I started reading it because I was out on this walk. And it said, a riparian zone is an in-between space between a water and the dry land, where water and land permeate one another. And it's an interface between these two different kinds of habitats. Yet it itself is extremely rich, it's biodiverse, and it's a filtration system that kind of cleans out both the water and the land. So here I was looking over this like little marshy area, which we also have by the bay here as well. But this was specifically in this lake, and I said, oh my God, this is like the film industry is out there. I am an audience person standing up above the cliff looking out, but meanwhile, all this activity is happening in this one little area between the borders, and the borders are now permeable. And audiences and makers are starting to come together in dialogue. So now I'm going to kind of switch away from biology into what we see as being our role in participatory media, which is where audiences that are no longer audiences and makers which are now in dialogue with audiences are starting to find a new way to interact in these micro-habitats. And that's where many filmmakers now find themselves, at permeating borders in micro-habitats. And we have to say to ourselves, how do we have dialogue here? How do we make a living in these places? How do we continue to have space for this to continue being? So at NAMAC, what we've done is convene many groups around the country to talk a lot about these issues. Yet what we wanted to investigate was, what are the values of the people who decide to do what they do in the arts and continue to do what they do besides just business proposition. So what we came up with these groups was called the positive core of the media arts. And in this time, as Jean said, of extreme change, of this permeability, of not knowing exactly where we stand in terms of infrastructures that are changing so radically, so day to day, that we don't even really know what we're going to be doing in a year or two, I think that I would like to just give you what some of the core values are to insert into this dialogue, because as Jean said, we're no longer on the sidelines. We're no longer alternative. We're no longer marginalized. If in fact we take this moment in policy to do what can actually make a profound change for the next 2 or 3 generations, we have to ground it in certain kinds of values. So I'm kind of here to say what we think in the media arts some of those are, and maybe open that for discussion. So some of them are community building, empowerment and public voice, learning and mentoring. This is all things that will take place in this public space, catalyzing civic engagement and bringing together collective wisdom, supporting artists and individual voices, not just the collective voice, bridging all diverse cultures through independent media, inspiring audiences and innovating and collaborating together for greater impact. Now, in those 8 values, there's a lot of backstory in each one of them, which I won't go into right now, and you can find it on our website. But when we talk about business, when we talk about policy, what I'm bringing to this discussion is how we need to infuse these values into our future policy work and the discussions we bring. It's called what I call cultural infusion, and it makes a political process richer and more transformative. And we have that moment right now to move from the sidelines to the center. And how we protect this space will transform how that space in the future is going to be developed.
Thanks, Helen. David?
I agree with you. Well, first of all, my name is Davey D. I'm a journalist for a long time, a DJ, programmer, a lot of different hats for a very long time. You know, I see the potential for what's going on in terms of opportunities, but it's just potential. I was expecting under Barack Obama a lot of justice, in the sense that for years, when I was at Clear Channel, for example, artists had to pay to get their music on. And I just knew that this would be an opportunity to start yanking licenses and hold people accountable and those sorts of things. It didn't happen. I just knew that with the new technology, a lot of people who finally were able to organically have their voice put out there finally would have a space and see it grow and really be serious stakeholders in the different conversations that are going on. And when I say stakeholders, meaning that they themselves speak and give their own reality. What is going on with the cat in East Oakland who started a trend that the whole industry gets to eat off of? What's his take on it? Is he at this meeting? I've been at the White House twice. I didn't see them there. I saw people speaking on their behalf, but those people don't know what they're going through, because those folks are still not eating, per se. They're still going through the same struggle, and their voices are only used as a referencing point to validate those who are suddenly speaking for them. So it's the same old, same old. And I see that all around. I spend half my time in Texas. I see the same thing. You know, we talk about a geographical thing, so most of the conversation is from New York and Cali. There's a whole communities in the middle of the country that don't know what's going on. They're still doing what they need to do, but in terms of the opportunities that we talk about, those have bypassed them. And in the urban space, it's real tricky, because people outside the urban space will look and they'll see an artist and they'll go, well, you know, 50 Cent said, and Puffy said, and these people say, so therefore everything's all right. And from what I see and experience, they don't necessarily speak for the entire community. They're visible, but they don't tell the whole story, you know. And I think that other side of the story, even though it's told and we have the opportunity to put it in the blogosphere and we can point to all these different outlets to potentially see them, they're still not known, you know, to the mainstream. They're not even known on the progressive left. So, you know, what I mean by that is even in those enclaves where you do have a lot of traffic, you know, I'll use the Huffington Post, for example. It's a whole lot of people that I know that always have a complaint that, wow, you know, this space has all these people, but it doesn't reflect it. Like, when has East Oakland been in the Huffington Post? You know, when is South Austin or East Austin been in the Huffington Post? Using that as an example to reflect, you know, these other spaces where those voices are consistently absent. Same thing with, you know, our brown brothers and sisters, you know. For example, what's going on in Arizona has been going on for almost a year, working with that community. It's just now that it's a flashpoint, but everything building up to it, including these attempts to wipe away ethnic studies or what's going on in Texas to take away the books, all those things were gone. And so I bring this up to say that two things. One, there's a lot of people in these artistic communities that have been speaking about this. And for whatever reason, they're not known. And it's not as simple as saying, well, they just need to try harder and get into these spaces and things will happen. It's a combination of, one, some of them really have the task of being brought up to technological proficiency. That's a real challenge. The other thing is that as this new opportunity is set up, we've gone back to a certain set of hierarchy, if that makes sense. So in some spaces, it's still what comes on the radio, what comes on BET, what a group of, you know, nonprofits have to say about these other folks that they may not have really sat down and spent serious time with. And lastly, when we do have these gatherings, they're not here to speak for themselves at the end of the day. And so what will happen is we'll go down the line and all this potential will be there and we'll still have the same old at the end of the day, just maybe a few other, might have you might have some newer faces, but there'll be few. And we'll still have a large majority of people whose voices, understanding of things is not done. And I'll just kind of underscore this by looking at a couple of things. One, the battle around net neutrality. I've been covering that for a good 5 or 6 years, even when we were battling with this on the COPAC. The fact that it even got to be a debate is reprehensible to me. You know, it's like, how did that happen? The fact that you have Jesse Jackson and all these civil rights organizations, who I know personally weren't even trying to do internet stuff 4 or 5 years ago, suddenly showing up and becoming instant experts in speaking, and then having some sort of traction is a problem for me. And even though Obama's like, yeah, we're going to fast track it, it got to be a debate and it got to be a confusing one for a lot of people. That should have never happened under this administration, and it goes to show you the hierarchy that exists. The second thing that I noticed is Obama was able to tap into the artistic community and really energize people with those people being touch points in a lot of places. And afterwards, I never saw those quote-unquote touch points ever used again. So when we had the healthcare debate, when we had the immigration thing going on, I mean, we can go down the list of things that these artists were absent from. We didn't see a follow-up with radio, you know, and we didn't see any sort of satisfaction with that. The only thing we heard was that radio will have to pay the artists, but we never had even those artists get up there and say, oh, by the way, Kathy Hughes charges $1,000 to listen to her record. What are we going to do about that? You know, Greg Lawley's charging $3,000 for airplay. What are we going to do about that? You know, name some names. Let's start talking. And everybody wanted to be silent as they jockey for position to get into a certain space where they can maintain, to a certain degree, a status quo. So, in my opinion, not a whole lot has seriously changed. And what I'm waiting to see is, as the dust settles, will we have the same old, except it's a little bit more technologically advanced. You see what I'm saying? Is it going to be that sort of situation? Same people locked out are still locked out. Same people who have this creative energy that may inspire some things. People who don't create, soak it up, monetize it, put a price tag to it, copyright it, trademark it, and it becomes their own, and you still have the proverbial Pookies and Ray Rays in order not really having their position in life change. So I see that going on, and that to me is problematic. Now, how you solve that is going to be a challenge, because it really means sharing space in a very fundamental way, in a way that does away with the natural tendency to be the head person in charge or to be the big man on campus, which is what I think ruined the arts in the first place. You know, you always had a middleman who became the presenter of the art, and suddenly they became the most important. Why is the radio station more important than the artist? Why is the record label more known than the artists themselves? Why is the web space more important than those artists who are creating? And usually being a soundtrack for a community whose voices have been marginalized for a very long time. So how that changes, I think that there's a potential for it to do so, but it's going to take some will. You know, and then I'll just also close, even, you know, included in this artist community, you get radio stations like ours at Pacifica. Why are we still struggling? Why are all these stations still struggling under Obama? You know, because everybody else has taxed them, or there's been no support, and there's been, more importantly, not even having them at the table to say what y'all think. You know, how are y'all seeing this thing, and can we make sure that when we're making these new rules and we're coming to this understanding that your perspective in these things are included. We're still looking for the Jesse Jacksons and the 1 or 2 figureheads, you know, to represent entire communities, and I think that they're off in a big way. So that's where I see it right now.
Thanks, Davey.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, great. So I would follow up on a lot of what Davey said about the kind of the potential and the challenges. And I guess I'll introduce myself too. I'll say, my name is Yolanda Hippensteele. I'm an independent consultant working with a lot of organizations in the media policy space, including groups like Arts and Democracy and the Media and Democracy Fund, and I've worked with Future of Music and with NAMAC. So I've been in this kind of media policy space for a long time. And I think right now is a time of a lot of hope in a lot of ways, and a lot of potential in a lot of ways, like Davey said, right? He referenced the fact that the arts are really what got Obama elected in a lot of ways, right? Between visual artists like Shepard Fairey and musicians like will.i.am, and just really generating the buzz and that kind of feeling of hope that really sent Obama into office, right? So I think he knows that, and some people know that, right? That the arts were really critical in that, and that arts are going to continue to be critical, kind of in the future of our nation in a lot of ways. That's a sign of hope, right? That's something that's good. Some other things that are good. There are a lot of people that we know now who are in decision-making positions, right? Jean referenced that we being kind of, advocates of, independent artists and media reform, media justice. We spent a lot of time on the outside, right, kind of yelling and screaming about everything that was going wrong in the last administration. In this administration, a lot of us, not us, but people we know, are now the people who are in those decision-making seats, right? So now people answer our phone calls when we call and we've got something that we want to talk about. They'll have meetings with us when we want to have a meeting. That is vastly different than under the past administration, right? We couldn't get anybody to pick up our phone calls in the last time. So at least now we get the meeting, right? At least somebody listens to us. At least we know the person in charge who we can talk to, right? Are they doing anything? Not yet. Or in some cases, yes, in some cases, no, right? But we've got that access, right? So that's a part of hope. Another thing is, too, a lot of these people who are leaders and decision makers in the agencies that matter to us and in the congressional offices that matter to us are really smart people who understand the issues, who have some vision for this stuff. Again, different from, the past 8 years. These are all things that provide a lot of potential, right? And in addition to all that potential of kind of having a lot of the right people in the right places and a lot of access, it's a time right now where there's a lot of attention to these issues. There's a ton of attention on technology, right? Everybody understands how technology is totally reshaping the way that we do work, the way that we communicate with each other, the way we distribute music and art, right? People get that. There's a lot of attention to media, right? There's been this whole crisis in journalism that everybody's talking about, which has also triggered a reassessment of the whole media environment and how does it get paid for, right? Does it get paid for under the same kind of like corporate-owned, advertising-sponsored model that people are talking about with journalism, but that conversation transfers also to music and to media arts and to other stuff. There's a conversation about do we need to reinvest in kind of public media, funding that a little bit more? Do we need to invest in all the kinds of, artistic production and distribution, right? So there's just a lot of potential here, like, swirling all around. But there are also a lot of challenges, right? Like on the policy level, we talk about in Washington, and this is true also in the states, there's no money. That's a big, we're in the middle of an economic crisis. The federal government's strapped for cash. All the state governments are strapped for cash. Everybody's strapped for cash, right? So anything that we want to do in terms of like funding new programs, funding artists, where's the money going to come from is always the question, right? There is an environment right now of intense partisanship and acrimony. It is a nightmare, right? We came in on this idea of hope, right? Hope, everything will be really nice, but it's not. It's the the kind of the acrimony is worse than it's ever been, I think, in terms of the parties not wanting to work with each other. This is especially true in Washington when you're trying to pass bills through the legislature, right? You all know nothing's passing, right? And there's really, as intense as ever, or more so, corporate opposition, right? Even though the governments don't have any money, and the advocates don't have any money, and the artists don't have any money, the corporations still have plenty of money, and they're using it to lobby for policies that are going to kind of shape the new system to be not just like the old system, but to favor them just as much or more than the old system did, right? They still have a ton of money, and they have an agenda and a vision and an understanding about how they're going to kind of shape these new technologies for them, right? To kind of create that same corporate stranglehold on the media. So. That's a lot. And then, the kind of hope idea is also, it's there, but in a way it's a little bit of a fallacy also, especially in Washington on the federal level, because, it's still politics as usual in Washington, right? Although, I believe that Barack Obama, is a guy who's, kind of different than all the other politicians, and that he's got some people around him who are, he also has a lot of people who are like just the same old, DC politics as usual people in his administration, and that's true also in Congress and anywhere else that anything is moving. So a lot of hope, a lot of potential, a lot of challenges to work with. And so, the only way out of this, right, if we want to do anything, because this moment is so important, is just intense activism, right? Like, somehow we all in this room and everybody in this building and all of us who we know have to, like, mobilize in such a way that we've never mobilized before, right? Because there is so much potential, right? And we're not fighting against things anymore. We're fighting for things. And, as Jean said, it's a really hard time because we're so used to working in opposition that it's taking us all some time to figure out how do we actually govern, right? How do we actually, like, put ourselves in a position to make the laws and make the rules. So maybe I turn it back to Jean to talk a little bit more about, like, activism, what people can do, or discussion.
So now you've heard four slightly different, each of us have a different take based on kind of what kind of work we're doing, the landscape that we're working in right now. I think that I want to pick up on some of both Yolanda and Davey's points in terms of, why do the radio stations and the record labels and the people in the web space, why are they more important than the artists? And I think that from my perspective, I think that you hear from them more because they are more organized, because they all run businesses, and because they understand how to work together to accomplish goals. I think with the artist community, and anybody who has had a different experience should feel free to speak up. But I mean, the artist community is very diverse. They don't always agree on, well, there are very few things that all artists will agree on. They're very difficult to organize, especially those that, like maybe symphony orchestras you can organize because some of their, all their members might be in a union or something like that. But when you get to a genre like jazz, for example, where, at least half of the working jazz musicians out there may not have gone to music school even. So, like, how do you even track them down to kind of take the pulse? So, I mean, I think that there's a particular challenge with individual artists, as you would have with freelancers, as you would have with many other kinds of kind of unorganized communities that come to play when you talk about why aren't people at the table. But I think there's also more than that. And I would like to talk about kind of like what does it take to get the communities who aren't at the table to the table, especially now given that there are all these tables with open spaces now. Like, do people even know about it? So some of it's an education question.
Well, I would disagree. I don't think the artists are disorganized at all. I could give you a whole list of people that are very organized. We could start with the work that people like Invincible does in Detroit, Rebel Diaz, Boots and Paris. We can go down the list. I don't think they're unorganized in the least bit. But what there is a habit of is going to certain go-to people. And those go-to people don't always, in my opinion, have the breadth of what's going on. I use the example of geographical referencing. New York for a long time was always the place because it was the media market. You wake up, you go down the street, all of a sudden that became the whole perspective for a very, very long time, at least in urban spaces. Then it became California, but then you have a whole other segment that exists within. Now, in a lot of these spaces, you have this consolidation and syndication. So Tom Joyner says so therefore it must be. Doug Banks or whoever says so therefore it must be. And there's all these myriad of layers that exist that I think we take the time in the progressive community to figure out. We know there's Politico and there's, there's Huffington and there's Alternate. We know there's like 5 or 6 different places that we go to get that information, but it's still a one-size-fits-all for many communities that we may not be familiar with. So the perception is that, well, they must be unorganized, as opposed to maybe we just didn't take the time to really know what's going on. What's the question? Like, if you talk to me, the question should be not just what I think, but what are your peers saying? And give me some other names and numbers so that we can maybe bring them into a room and feel where they're coming from. You feel, you know what I'm saying? And then we have a wider array, because I may have a perspective that I'm passionate about, but Mr. Fab, whose people are here right now, may have a whole different take on things, and that's important to see there as well. So that's a thing that I see continuing. Unfortunately now, is that because people don't have political game? They don't understand the politics and all that, some of that, but a lot of us didn't understand the politics either. And we had the doors open for us, but did we close the door, or did we sit up there and say, you know what, there's about 10 other people outside that room. What I've seen, and I've seen this over the years, people get comfortable when they get in that position, and they're like, well, I'm here now. you know, and then I'm gonna block everybody from getting in. You see that, you know, it's the proverbial thing about there can only be one woman in the corporate office, only one black person there, because they lose that status of importance in the eyes of the decision makers. So that's something to consider, and I think the potential for that change can happen if we start to really look and make sure that at the very least we're aware of those perspectives that are out there, so we're not off base on some things. That's just where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Davey said, and I also think that there really is a lack of education and organizing, right? There's some of that exists, but there are so many people who need to be involved who just are unaware that any of these policy debates are happening, right? I mean, we all would be, except that this is what we do for our work, right? And I don't know how you all know about any of this stuff, and so it'd be interesting to open that up to a discussion. But I just think it's so easy to not know because the mainstream media is not covering this stuff. Most of the kind of music-oriented blogs and magazines and all that stuff are also not covering the policy stuff, right? So you got to be really digging deep and looking for it in order to be engaged and be informed. But I mean, because things come up all the time, right? Like proceedings, like at the FCC, there's just they just closed this open comment period and this massive docket about the future of media, right? So they're looking for comments from anybody in any part of media, especially organizations that represent artists and represent other media makers, to kind of say, hey, what do you think we should consider? They're going to make recommendations to other agencies even. So it's like not even just the stuff that the FCC has jurisdiction over. So there's this like opportunity to really have some input, and they really want to hear from people. Actually, I'll tell the story, Helen, about we were in DC recently. Helen was at a meeting that I organized with some public media and community media folks who were just getting together for us to talk about collaboration. And these guys from the FCC kind of came and like crashed the meeting. Somebody tossed them an invite the day before because they heard that this group of community media leaders was meeting. They really wanted to talk to them about, hey, we want your input on this docket that we're running at the FCC, right? So like, something that never would have happened in the past administration, right? Like people who are making the decisions are really reaching out to communities that they know aren't giving their comments into the proceedings. So that's happening, but I think it's incumbent upon all of us to also be kind of bringing in more people into those debates and let people know when those opportunities are there.
So we're all policy wonks on this side of the table, so we can just keep doing this for hours. But I know that we only have about 5 or 6 minutes left in this session, so I wanted to make sure you guys had an opportunity to ask any questions or kind of dig in or even change the direction of the conversation. Yes?
I have a question. You touched on this briefly, but there really is a really narrow range of opinion that's expressed in the mainstream media. That's a real problem.
Yeah.
And that's why there's a lack of knowledge, there's a lack of organization, there's a lack of people, being able to organize around issues.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you say dig deep, you have to dig really, really deep these days. I mean, the media is so heavy in the propaganda. What would you suggest? I mean, just on a grassroots level.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple answers to that question. I would go straight to the policy answer, which is, right, there's like, stuff we have to do to find out about this stuff, but also this is why we're doing what we're all doing, is why we're talking about what we're doing when we talk about kind of fighting for things like net neutrality to kind of keep the internet open and free. When we talk about increasing broadband access, right, because these are like, the internet is a platform that can be more democratic, that can, kind of provide a way to get out information that you couldn't get out in like the mainstream news media through newspapers and that type of stuff. At least the option is there, right? There's still there's still stuff to do there. But I think that structural change is really going to be necessary in order for us to save that in the future. In terms of the kind of what do we do now, right?
Yeah.
I've been talking a lot, so I can toss that to somebody else.
One thing we're doing in our field is that we realize that film and video and visual arts people really have totally no access to policy. We ourselves only recently did within the last 5 years. We're sort of not exactly in the mix centrally in DC kinds of things. So what we've decided to do is go out to our grassroots and really try and find individuals, artists, and people who run very small grassroots arts organizations and get them trained. Get them trained on first steps. What we all also just learned in the first few years was how to go to your regional representatives in your city, then how to kind of get ready for the state, then be ready for national. And when we were at meetings with our congressional representatives from California last week, they trying to get support for the FCC's reclassification of, and you guys can explain this Title II thing around net neutrality that happened last year. They said, gee, you know, we never hear from any of you in the arts. We're bombarded daily with trillions of emails from your opposition, daily, constant flow, boom, boom, but we never really hear from you. Where are you guys?
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, can I just say something? I certainly understand, I know that that's the case. You know, I think one of the problems that you have, whether it's the superstar artists and the people around them, or the struggling artist, you know, just trying to, you know, play a venue and make $100, it's they're all so completely self-consumed, you know, in their careers, that these things seem, you know, just like really esoteric and tangible, and taking these can be quite complicated issues, and distilling it down to information that is easily digested by either the artist or the artist representatives is a massive, massive challenge. Mm-hmm. Even when you can get their attention for 10 minutes, that's a challenge. Getting their attention for 10 minutes on one of these issues is a challenge. And then once you do, being able to make it make sense and then provide them with something that's actionable, it's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge.
I would agree. You know, artists per se, by nature, egos and insecurity is what drives it. But when I define art, I'm not just talking about the guy who creates the music per se. There's a whole community that's around that artist. And that, when I say art, for me, I'm thinking about that community that is around that artist, because usually his craft is influenced and comes from the people that surround him. And to that degree, that's not being spoken to. You know, net neutrality was never, there wasn't even a commercial on BET about it. There was never a conversation. How many of us went to these spaces where there were these artists and said, let me pull you in a room and let's have this conversation. And I'll show you what I mean by disconnect. When we did the Free Press thing in Minneapolis, I fought real hard so that we could bring like some of the popular urban sites and sit them right next to the popular progressive sites, Huffington Post and all hip hop. Neither one knew about each other, you know. But the follow-up was that one closed the door and the other didn't. You know, so I see the guys from all hip hop and it's like, okay, they never asked you to do a blog. There was never any in exchange. It was kind of like, well, that's what y'all do. This is what we do. Those are artist communities. Now I can turn on the Huffington Post and go, oh, there's Chuck D writing an article and here's so-and-so. But the opportunity to bring some very divergent communities together and make them aware of somebody to their respective strength. One strength being in hip hop and urban culture, the other one being in these policy things, was missed. And when you start to ask the question, nobody seems to know what's going on. I'm one to ask. I have no shame in just speaking my mind. And that becomes very uncomfortable, but it's a very real situation that, you know, you go 6 months, a year from now, or come in the election, for example, you might not have the returns that we are looking for. Nobody, for example, is having a conversation with all these urban stations and going, how come you all not talking about some of these important policy issues? Who gets on the phone with Chewy and say, Chewy, what are you talking about? Steve Harvey, what are you talking about? You know, Big Vaughn, what are you talking about? Because if they're the touching points and we don't have time and energy to go to those communities, then all of us will suffer to the degree that they may be on the same political spectrum as we are. So all of a sudden you got 20% turnout, 18% in New York, 20% in Texas. You know, I mean, we start going down the road and you're going, whoa, how's this happening? When we have 1 million blogs and 1 million organizations and 1 million meetings, it says to me that there's a whole bunch of people that ain't being spoken to by us as well as the mainstream. And my fear is that we will suffer politically and maybe economically and other ways if we're not hitting these folks in ways that's going to be compelling. You know, even those mainstream artists, obviously, I'll give you one example and I'll just close. I did a list, you know, of all the people that have millions of hits, you know, on their Twitter thing, to find out who was talking about the immigration thing when that bill went by. Only person I saw was Questlove. That's a damn shame. There was no Diddy tweets and, you know, start naming them. None of them bothered to say anything. And to me, that just says, well, if those artists are disconnected from a reality that's going on, a major one right now. I haven't even seen a Gulf spill thing, being spoken about. So then I'm looking like, well, who's their community? Is their record label pushing that issue and encouraging them to say that? Is the radio station talking about that? Well, these touch points ain't doing it, so that comes back to us. We're that next level, so how are we reaching them? And are we going to all those enclaves and jamming them up and being like, are you all talking about this? And if not, then it won't get talked about. I mean, when you all had the thing in D.C., and I wrote the little post, like, how y'all gonna have a conversation about blogging and not mention net neutrality? People got pissed, but fuck it, who cares? Because this will affect me at the end that you didn't talk about it. At the end, I mean, to the degree that I know, for what I want to do. So somebody's got to say something so that these communities can start to be empowered. And so it's not just the artists, but it's those entire communities, and that's where I'm at on it.